5 cruel Nazi experiments on people. During the Second World War, prisoners of Nazi concentration camps were subjected not only to unbearable physical labor, hunger and cruel abuse, but also became victims of monstrous experiments by German doctors.
Sterilization and the effective use of death on menstruation. On July 14, 1933, the law for the prevention of the birth of offspring with hereditary diseases came into effect throughout Nazi Germany. According to him, some categories of citizens, for example, those with physical deformities, those with dementia and schizophrenia, the blind, the deaf, and alcoholics, that to be deprived of the opportunity to have offspring in order to preserve the purity of the Aryan race. Later, during the war, they decided to subject them to forced sterilization. Jews, Gypsies, and Africans. To accomplish this, it was necessary to find a new, more effective and faster method of mass sterilization, because vasectomy and tubal ligation were too long and expensive procedures. Experiments to find a new method included the use of X-rays, injections, and surgery, and the subjects were already prisoners. Most often, men and women were sterilized using X-rays. Their testicles or ovaries were removed and then sent for examination. Typically, patients who underwent such manipulation suffered from radiation burns. Because of this, prisoners ended up in gas chambers as they became unfit for work. The second method of sterilization was intravenous injections of iodine and silver nitrate. They served their purpose, but had many side effects, such as causing vaginal bleeding or genital cancer. Therefore, the method had to be abandoned. Psychological experiments related to the reproductive system were also carried out under the Nazi regime. For example, in Austria, Dr. Hermann Stewie studied the effects of stress on the reproductive system of women. He told the prisoners the date of their death and observed how this affected their menstrual cycle. Many of the subjects were raped after learning of the day of death in order to study the possibility of conception in a stressful situation. After the women were killed, Steve dissected them to examine their reproductive organs. Dehydration, an experiment to study ways to turn seawater into drinking water, was carried out at the Dachau camp in 1944 by Dr. Hans Epiner. He tried to find a way to drink Wehrmacht soldiers in the absence of fresh water. As part of the study, a group of almost 100 Wehrmacht received only filtered seawater instead of food and water. Dachau survivor Joseph Chotnik later recalled that the victims of the experiment were dehydrated and thirsty so badly that they looked for any way. Some of them licked the newly washed floors and squeezed the rags into their mouths, trying to get at least some liquid. Stitching twins and dyes in eyes. To increase the rate of reproduction of German citizens, experiments were carried out on twins in concentration camps. The head of the research was Dr. Joseph Mengele, later known as the Angel of Death. From 1943 to 1944, he conducted experiments on 1,500 pairs of twins imprisoned in the Auschwitz camp. About 200 people survived the experiments. The operations that were performed on the twins were varied. They tried to change the iris of their eyes by injecting dyes into their eyes so that they would turn from brown to blue. Mengele also tried to artificially create Siamese twins by sewing brothers and sisters together. All of the stitched twins developed gangrene and eventually died. It happened that only one twin became an experimental subject. He, for example, was infected with an infection. After a while, both were killed, and during the autopsy, the organs of the healthy twin were compared with the organs of the infected one. Crushed glass and wood shavings in the wounds. From 1942 to 1943, in the Ravensbrück camp, Concentration camp prisoners had their skin cut on their calves, and tetanus, streptococcus, and gas gangrene bacteria were rubbed into the wounds. Along with infections, crushed glass and wood shavings were added to the open wound. This was necessary to recreate the damage from a combat wound. In this way, German doctors tried to find ways to help their soldiers in battle and develop new treatment methods. Experiments with pressure. Experiments were conducted at the Dachau concentration camp to help German pilots cope with the low pressure at altitude. The series of experiments was led by Dr. Sigmund Rescher. In a letter addressed to Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, he described the results of an experiment in a low-pressure chamber that simulated conditions at an altitude of up to 21,000 meters. From a letter from Dr. Rescher to Heinrich Himmler, only long-term experiments at altitudes above 5 kilometers led to death. The third experiment of this type was so extraordinary that I caught the SS camp doctor as a witness. This was a long-term experiment without oxygen at an altitude of 12 kilometers, carried out on a 37-year-old Jew in good general condition. Breathing continued for 30 minutes. After 4 minutes, the subject began to sweat and shake his head. After 5 minutes, convulsions began. Between 6 and 10 minutes, breathing accelerated, and the subject lost consciousness. From 11 to 30 minutes, breathing slowed to 3 breaths per minute, stopping completely. Severe cyanosis developed. During the process, foam appeared at the mouth. After breathing stopped, the ECG continued recording until the heart stopped completely. Hour after breathing stopped, the autopsy began. After this letter, Himmler ordered the doctor to continue the experiments and try to bring these people back to life. If the victim was able to be revived, she was pardoned, allowing her to remain in a concentration camp for the rest of her life without ending up in a gas chamber.